I think we're born storytellers. The moment we leave our mother's body and take our first breath, we tell our first story. It's a moving one, told in the form of a llanto, a plaintive wail, a plead to be returned to the garden from which we have been expelled. In her book, Defectors, The Rise of the Latino Far Right and What It Means for America, author Paola Ramos cites psychologist Dr. Vamek D. Volkan on what he calls perennial mourning, the sense of loss that shadows immigrants and their families as they navigate new environments. He continues, it's the most common psychological condition among dislocated persons. That's why immigrants often hold on to stories as a way of never fully letting go of their lost place of origin, a practice that is passed on from generation to generation. I can relate. Storytelling was a huge part of my upbringing. Most of the stories I heard were about my father and the men on his side of the family. The lore sounded like something Gabriel Garcia Marquez could have written, full of bohemian poets and dreamers. There were stories about castles and sages. There was even a story that involved automatic writing and a haunting that drove my great-uncle to madness, so he had to be isolated in a lighthouse. But the women? They were peripheral to the stories. When they were mentioned, it was in relation to the men, as in the wife of this man or the mother of that man. I understand now that for my father, a Mexican man in this country, the stories were buttresses against relentless blows to his self-esteem. And as long as my center of gravity was my nuclear family, by propping him up, the mythos seemed to help me too. But the story's illusion that time only flowed backwards and only towards men became problematic as I, a Mexican girl, navigated present-day America. Year by year, story by story, what had been a narrative salve for my father acted as an accelerant to the harm I experienced in this country where Latinas hold so little value. I had no handbook, no inspirational stories of overcoming to guide or shield me. Adding to the harm, the stories he relied on put me in a double bind. I was a lost child. But if I admitted my fear and pain, I would leave my father defenseless. Heavy as the burden was, I carried it because the stories had implicitly taught me something. That men were to be protected from the world. My job, even as a little girl, was to erase myself so they wouldn't have to face it. Fortunately, I also internalized the power of storytelling and started to build my own anthology when I left home. Only instead of shielding me from the world, mine is meant to place me in it. So I'm building it on an honest foundation of imperfect grit and boundless gratitude. I have only the memory of my lived experiences to rely on, but it's a start. And although I know that my perspective is limited and not the whole truth, what story is? One of the most beautiful things I ever heard was that we can listen people into existence. So, may I tell you a story? This is about my grandmothers. I'm named after my paternal grandmother, Esther. So, Marie Esther. I know nothing about her, except that she was nervous and kind. When I was little, people who knew her would stop in their tracks when they heard my voice. They told me I sound just like her. Thank you. Abuelita Esther for my voice. My maternal grandmother, Lupita, loved birds and kept parakeets in pristine cages in her backyard. And every time she stepped outside, the birds made a joyful fanfare. She had a little dirty dog named Suki that would follow her around. There was a mango tree that shaded her backyard. I suspect she planted it long before I was born. She had a green thumb and turned the concrete walls of her courtyard into a lush garden. She had built it out of random plant cuttings she placed in leftover cans. To Lupita, every vessel was a potential garden, including me. Thank you, Abuelita Lupita, Master Gardener, for planting me in this world. And thank you for listening.